Hello everybody, it is Magnus Carlsen time once again. He did win 4 games in a row in the Super Tournament in Wijk aan Zee. And in the 8th round he faced the tail-ender Baadur Jobava. There we see the standings, Carlsen in shared first place with 5 out of 7. Baadur Jobava on 1.5 out of 7. However, Jobava is coming off a win actually. He started with half out of 6, then beat Radek Wojtaszek. So things are improving for him. Let's have a look how this game went. Do we have a picture of the two players? We might not have a picture. We might have a picture. Here we are, Baadur Jobava with the white pieces against the world champion on the black side of the board. And Baadur Jobava, on the first move already, he does something that has made him a fan favorite. He goes for the move b3. He's capable of playing quite some offbeat openings. And then once in a while he plays a normal opening, and we're always disappointed that he's not entertaining us from the get-go. I don't think Magnus Carlsen was that disappointed to see 1b3. The world champion has been struggling a bit against moves like 1d4 recently, so 1b3 probably did not make him too unhappy. He goes g6, preparing to counter White's fianchetto with a fianchetto of his own. Bishop b2 now would not be a good time to establish that fianchetto because bishop g7 runs into bishop takes g7. So of course knight f6. Knight f6 is the world champion's idea. Here it's important to know that bishop takes f6 is not that strong a threat. Black recaptures, here's the two bishops. Normally white now tries to clamp down on the d5 square by playing c4 and knight c3. But black is in time to go d5 himself, when he should be alright. C takes d, queen takes d5, knight c3, queen somewhere, d6 or d8. Let's say d6. And this position is fine for black. So instead, Jobava plays a move that goes against a lot of things that we learn in school. He plays a move knight to c3. I don't like this move one bit. It just looks funny. He blocks his own bishop. He blocks his c-pawn. This looks very artificial. This makes a lot more sense if you do it on the king side, preparing short castles, but on the queen side it just feels weird. To go g3, bishop g2, knight f3 is of course a completely natural setup, but that at least clears the way for the king. So I'm not very big on this setup b3, bishop b2, knight c3, but it turned out that it's not the first time Jobava played this. He actually played it before in a game against Mamedyarov. That's what has made him such a fan favorite. He's willing to stick to these offbeat lines and use them against the very best, like the world champion Magnus Carlsen. He goes bishop g7. It's another move that I find very strange, the move d4. After he worked so hard to get his bishop on this diagonal, he now blocks it by playing d4. And somehow this setup with knight c3, bishop b2 just feels very wrong to me. What can I say? However, this is still his game against Mamedyarov. He clearly likes the unconventional nature of the positions this leads to. Even more unconventional would have been a move like knight to d5 or knight to e4, trying to exchange the knights very quickly. And who knows, this might have been a better idea, inflicting black with a double pawn, even though black should of course be fine after, let's say, castles. Still, Jobava played d4. Carlsen went c5. d5 looks also pretty natural to me. But he went c5, hoping to provoke white into going d5, which would lose. Queen a5, winning by pinning, threatening knight to e4, and if white unpins by going queen to d2, there's another little trick. You can take on d5 and win a pawn. Say knight takes d5, queen d2, king d2, bishop e5, rook to b1. Looks like a double attack. And it is a double attack, but it's easily defended by bishop e5, and black is better. So Jobava played e3 as if nothing had happened. Carlsen took on d4, pawn takes, and d5, which already looks like a very pleasant version of, I don't know what to describe it, a queen's gambit reversed maybe. Black will go knight c6, castles, and it's still not so clear what white has gained with this. Queen to d2, knight to c6, f3, taking the e4 square under control, but once again not contributing a whole lot to development. It looks like Jobava is preparing to go castle queenside and g4, creating a potential attack against the black king. However, it looks highly unnatural and very, very hard to believe. Magnus Carlsen decides to prevent both castles queenside and the move g4 with his next move, move h5. I'm not sure. To me it looks a bit like he's forcing Jobava to consolidate and play normally, while maybe he should have encouraged him to go for this idea with g4 and long castle. When it comes to mind, for example, is the move a6, stopping white from going bishop b5, which he will do in the game. It's a bit hard to believe that g4, this is a good setup. However, who knows, it would have led to a very different type of position. And we are not going to see it because Carlsen played h5, which can't be bad either, of course. He's stopping g4, he's preparing bishop h6, so castling queenside is never very tempting. Could always run into bishop h6, which at the very least would force f4, which is a concession positionally. So h5, bishop b5 is played, very sensible under the circumstances, planning knight e2, and then maybe even castles kingside if necessary. Queen to d6, not forced, but it makes sense to protect this knight with the queen as well, so should white take, you can recapture with the queen, not weakening your pawns. Knight ge2. The next move I'm really not very fond of, the move bishop h6. It looks a bit like Carlsen got slightly provoked by his opponent. A bit dubious opening play and tries to punish it very early. But strategically, bishop h6 doesn't do all that much because, well, doesn't do all that much good. It takes the queen. But it allows white, and we will see this in the game, to offer an exchange of bishops with bishop c1, and this exchange favors white because the white bishop on b2 was doing nothing, was just passive, while the black bishop on g7 was playing a pretty good job looking at d4 and safeguarding his king in the future. So I'm not a fan of bishop h6. I will even say he should have played a6, bishop c6, queen c6. When Carlsen wasn't sure he was better after a move like a4, but even if he's not much better, black clearly has a very pleasant position after, let's say, castles with the two bishops and the white pieces on slightly dubious squares. So this looks like a normal course of events with a black advantage. So bishop h6 was played, hoping for f4, but no such thing. Jobava goes queen d1, gives up on the idea of castling queenside. Bishop to f5, and the very strong move bishop c1, as mentioned earlier. He wants to exchange these bishops. Bishop takes, not sure, maybe even bishop g7 was worth considering, but of course that would admit that bishop h6 was not such a great idea. So bishop takes, rook takes, and rook c8, queen to d2, black castles finally. And Jobava takes another good decision, or a good decision here, gives up his bishop on c6. Had he castled instead, then black could keep this knight, and I believe the world champion would have done that, play knight d8, because in this structure a knight is probably more useful than the bishop on b5. The knight can be used to take the d4 pawn later, while, for example, the bishop can't and the white bishop can't defend it. So it's a good idea to capture this knight before it gets a chance to go away. Bishop takes c6. The next move is very surprising, at least to me. Carlsen goes pawn takes c6, which feels wrong positionally. He weakens his pawns on c6 and a7, and he weakens the squares in front of them. The c5 square and some squares on the a file, which was not really needed. He could have taken with a rook. He did not like that white can go knight d1, knight e3. He's left with a slightly passive bishop on f5, which is true, but still it's hard to believe that black could ever be worse here, at the very least after b5, rook fc8, even though he might not be better. And I think Carlsen overreacted a bit by going b takes c6 in this position, weakening a lot of squares. Knight to a4, emphasizing that there are some weaknesses now. Rook fe8, castles e5, looking for active counterplay in the center. And Jobava just plays c3, preparing to recapture on d4 with the pawn, keeping control over the c5 square, and also preparing to go b4 and knight c5. And now after his slightly ambitious opening, the position has settled, and white has a very normal position where he could even think about being better one day because of the dark squares on the queen side, which he could put his knights on. Still, black has a pretty normal position as well and is quite active. He goes h4, grabbing some extra space, and he's not really worse or in trouble here or anything, but given the opening, this position is a huge success for white. D takes e5 was played, rook takes e5, and b4, another good positional move, securing this square. Rook ce8, knight to d4. Now all of a sudden the white knights have very pleasant squares to jump to on d4 and c5. h3. Carlsen is trying to mix it. He understands he's not better strategically anymore, so he's looking for ways to open the king side, make something happen with his active rooks at least. Plays h3. Jobava reacts with g3. Could have thought about g4. When the piece sacrifice bishop g4, fg looks quite tempting, but it does not really work. Rook e4 was mentioned by Carlsen, who attended the live show after the game, with the idea of rook g4, rook g2, but then white has a very strong queen h6. The queen coming to the aid of her king by attacking this pawn. After rook g4, king h1, white is just in time to go rook g2, queen takes h3, covering the h2 pawn and remaining a piece up. So after g4, black would have had to go bishop c8 with a normal position very similar to the game. g3, bishop c8 anyway, planning bishop a6 is not allowed, knight goes to c5. Those knights look very, very nice on their squares, so Carlsen offers to exchange one of them, knight to d7. Jobava refuses, but has to retreat by going knight d3, rook 5e7, and Jobava starts exchanging off rooks on the e-file where the black rooks are quite active. Rook fe1, now Carlsen decides to liquidate things on the queen side and to still work on exchanging his knight for one of the active white knights. Goes for the move c5, accepting an isolated pawn on d5, but in return also exposing the white pawns on c3 and a2, which also become isolated. After b takes c, knight takes c5. The position is still roughly equal. It feels a little more pleasant for white, but Carlsen is the world champion and he has kept things under control. After knight f4, now they swap a bunch of pieces. Takes, takes, takes. The rooks leave the board. And after knight e6, black will exchange his knight for one of the white knights after all. Jobava goes for knight f takes e6, which looks natural because the knight on d4 stays alive, which looks nice and centralized and active. I still believe that knight d takes e6 might have been a better move because while the knight on d4 looks nice, it doesn't do all that much. If you keep the knight on f4, this does a lot more work. Bishop takes and queen to e3. The knight keeps an eye on d5, keeps an eye on e6, an eye on g6, an eye on h3. While the white queen could go to d4. Black is still alright here, mainly because the white king is a little open and there is still this very, very annoying thorn in the flesh on h3. Black shouldn't be worse, but white can't be really worse here either. So the most likely is the game peters out somehow, something like queen b8, and there is dynamic equality on the board. Instead, Jobava decides to keep the d4 knight, also no big deal of course, I just like taking with the other knight better. Bishop takes e6, king to f2, bishop d7, queen to b1, nothing much really happening in this phase. Queen c7, queen b3, nice little move bishop c8, avoiding white's threat of queen d5 because now there's queen takes c3, and also hoping for a better future for this bishop by giving it access to this diagonal where it could potentially, too many arrows, I'm sorry, could potentially form a battery together with Her Majesty, the queen. So bishop c8, good move, a3, a5, still planning bishop a6, queen b2, Jobava decides to not really do anything. You could also think about taking on d5, which should still keep the position pretty level. Queen b2, bishop a6, knight c2, good maneuver, activating this knight, which, as mentioned earlier, isn't doing all that much on d4, putting it on e3, where it at least keeps an eye on the d5 pawn. Bishop c4. Carlsen has managed to activate his bishop to the max, also defending this pawn with an active bishop. Could continue with a4, bishop b3. By now there's no question of black ever being worse. If anybody's better here, it is black, but white is very solid with his setup. So it doesn't look like his fortress could be breached if he just did nothing. But Jobava is not the type to just do nothing at all. And he goes for the move f4 here, creating some space on the king side, but also weakening the e4 square. Carlsen just waits, king h7, and Jobava keeps pushing his pawns. And this one, g4, I think is too much. He's pushing his luck here. It's also done on moves 38 and 39. The time control is on move 40. And it's a piece of advice a lot of young players get, which often turns out to be true. Don't move your pawns in time trouble if you don't have to, because pawns never move back and they could create weaknesses. I believe this was a case here where Jobava should have kept his pawns where they are and then evaluate after the time control if it's a good idea to go f4 and g4. In this position, I think it was not a good idea because of the strong move queen e7. Keeping an eye on both of the newly created inroads into the white position on h4 and e4, and all of a sudden it is very hard to defend this position. Probably the best solution, but a horrible decision to take on move 40, was to actually take on c4, d takes c4, and try to hold this queen's ending, say king f3, when it looks like white should still have very good drawing chances, but this is very hard to assess, and I'm not sure it's even true to go for this on move 40, so it's much more normal to play like Jobava did, the move queen c1, but this turns out to be yet another mistake. If he wanted to move the queen, he should have activated it, put it on b8, but once again, it was very tough to calculate. At least from b8, it defends the f4 pawn. Now, queen c1 is based on an oversight. The last three moves before the time control did not go well for the Georgian Baadur Jobava. Carlsen capitalizes, puts his queen on the best square, goes queen e4, attacking this pawn and activating to the maximum. Let's have a look now that the time control is over at the players. Here we got Baadur Jobava weighing his options. Me, as a hobby body language doctor, I think it's no stretch to say he does not look happy. Goes for the move f5. There we can see he's hiding his face, he's shaking his head a little bit. He is clearly not all that impressed with the way things have proceeded. The reason for that is that he miscalculated. He wanted to go for the move king g3. After he moved his queen from b2 to c1, now all of a sudden the e2 square is available for the black bishop. And this is a pretty common thing actually, that you forget or you miss a move which was not possible earlier because your queen was covering that square. But in this position, bishop e2 is just very strong, threatening queen f3 check. One possible line is the move queen to d2, queen f3 check, king h4, queen f2 check, king takes h3 doesn't work because of bishop takes g4, and black picks up the queen. So white has to go forward, king g5, but this also would not help him to save the game. f6 check, king takes f6, queen takes f4, king to e6. And let's check in with the world champion himself, what he
takes in d5. I go back. Pawn is gonna queen.
Yeah.
That's what's up. Thank you, Magnus. This pawn is gonna queen. So queen takes h2, just wins for black here. Instead, Jobava, as we saw in the video, after queen e4, he tried f5, but this creates a whole different set of problems. Now queen f4 check is very annoying. His king has to go passive to g1, and we can already see the effect of this pawn on h3. It's very cramping. The black pieces are active, and after gf5, there is also a new pawn weakness on f5, which is attacked immediately. Bishop d3. This pawn is going to drop. The rest is a question of world champion-esque technique, which is nothing Magnus Carlsen lacks. Queen to e1, bishop takes f5, pawn up. White can't recapture his pawn with knight takes d5 because it runs into queen g4 check. Queen g3, queen d1 check, picking up the knight on d5. Does not help. Well, if you do nothing, this bishop retreats to e6, covers all these pawns, and black should win because the white king is just too weak. So Jobava decided to go knight takes f5, queen takes f5, but now Carlsen is a pawn up in the queen ending, and once again the decisive factor is the white king just being too exposed thanks to the pawn on h3. There's always this queen f3, queen g2 mating construction. Black's position is just winning. Queen g3 was tried, king h6 wants to go all the way to h5, queen b8, queen f3, here we go, this mate threat is materializing. There is not a perpetual, the black king always finds enough space to hide, king g6, queen g8, king f6, queen d8, king f5, and Jobava decided to resign here. There's not really a lot he can do. The black king has complete freedom to walk all over the board, queen g2, mate is always a threat. There is never a perpetual. So he decided to call it a day. This is totally hopeless. Which means Magnus Carlsen wins 5 games in a row. Not his finest performance today, as he was very critical of it, his play out of the opening. He took some slightly strange decisions, maybe trying to punish Jobava's extremely strange setup. Did not look all that great, but then he showed why he is the world champion. He first equalized again and then won the game again from an equal position. Magnus Carlsen on a roll is in the sole lead now in the Tata Steel Masters after 8 rounds. He has, is it after 8 rounds? Yeah, it's after 8 rounds. He has 6 points. And we will see if he can win the first Super Tournament of 2015. There is still plenty of chess left. They played 13 rounds. Thank you guys for watching this video, and I'll see you around on Chess24 or doing commentary on the Wijk and Zee tournament in this channel. Thanks everybody, and see you then. Bye.